Alright, welcome. Alright, so let's dive into it. Spiritual warfare. You know, what's there to know about it? Well, here's a hot take. Every single person in existence has went through spiritual warfare, believe it or not. So it's not just a Christian thing, or it's not just a certain type of people thing. Everyone does it, or everyone goes through it. The difference is, one, there's different types of spiritual warfare, and two, you have to be operating on a certain wavelength to be even aware of this very fact. Some persons think that it's not important to really be aware, to be knowledgeable of spiritual warfare, but I disagree. And the reason for that is some persons even don't believe in these things, which is kind of interesting to say the least. And some persons will say, hey, I don't need to know these things because it doesn't affect my salvation. This doesn't affect my salvation, that does not affect my salvation. Well, yes, you're correct in saying that it doesn't affect your salvation. However, get this. Once you become converted, you make that important step forward, to make a change and to accept the Lord as a Savior. Once that happens, what next? Is it just a sweet journey going after that? Is it just happily ever after? On the contrary, we've even seen in the Bible the disciples, for example, going through persecution. That was not just a physical, literal thing. There was also spiritual implications going on there, because it was trials. These trials were no accident. So no, it's not life being happily ever after you've been converted. But get this, since the very day you were born, you have always been a target by the adversary. But now, the very moment you make that decision to serve God, you've not just been a target, but you've moved from a target to a threat. So expect things to ramp up going forward. We've always been a target from the very day we were born. Why? Because as humans, we possess something these demonic entities do not possess, and that is access to God's mercy. And I say access because in order to claim it, then there are certain steps that we have to do on our part in order to have this mercy from God that blots out our transgressions and make us a new being. But yes, these demonic entities do not have access to this. And so what do? They target us in an attempt to derail us from, truly finding God's mercy. And so when you are reborn, now the adversary will have to revamp his strategy in order to target us and to bring us down ultimately. Alright, so here's a scenario. Let's say you have just gotten saved and, reborn. And now you being converted, you make your game plan going forward, which is, okay, I'm going to read his word every day, and I'm going to go to church every week, and I'm going to pray, and then once I do these things, then I should be okay. I don't have anything to worry about, and life will be good. Now on paper, that seems like an okay plan, but the adversary on the back end would be saying, alright, I'm going to plan for you. So then the adversary starts to sow a seed of discord within you by sending attack upon attack upon attack. Now these attacks, as I said, they're spiritual, but they can manifest in several different ways. Misfortunes, attacks while you're asleep. There's a lot of ways he can attack you. But because you didn't see the importance of knowing about spiritual warfare, you wouldn't even be able to identify that these things that are happening to you are spiritual. So then what do you do? How do you respond? Well, naturally, you'd have noticed that ever since you'd have been reborn, that you would have never been seen these things happen to you. And so naturally, you would go to God in prayer and asking God, why is this happening now of all times? What is going on? And you shed some light on it. Now, assuming that this isn't a Daniel situation with the Prince of Persia ultimately blocking his prayer from being answered, God is faithful to always answer prayers. However, you may not be at that stage in that spiritual walk where you're able to discern his voice. And so, you may pray and you don't hear a response, but the only thing you see happening is more and more attacks keep on piling on. And there's this recurring theme, so I do not need to know about spiritual warfare. That's not important. I have salvation, so I'm okay. So attacks keep coming, and the adversary will start to whisper in the ear, God doesn't care about you that much. He doesn't hear your prayers. And at first, you would reject that and say, no, not my God, not my God. But as the attacks start to keep coming and coming and coming, ultimately you will eventually start to give in. You give in as you see that no matter how much time you pray to God, the attacks still keep on piling on. And so eventually you get to that breaking point where you end up give up on God. You lose hope, you lose trust, and you concede to what the adversary was trying to convince you of. But what the adversary would have actually have done is to put you in a cycle, all according to his plan, to ultimately get you to relinquish your relationship with God. And so now you depart from the faith, and now you're back to square one, being an unbeliever. Then that would have meant that the adversary would have succeeded in his plans for you. And in some instances, this can get to the extreme level where the person not only loses faith, but he becomes an atheist. Now, had the person seen the importance of being aware of spiritual warfare, then his response to these attacks, as well as the overall outcome, would have been completely different. So I hope that scenario was good to highlight or illustrate the importance of knowing about spiritual warfare. Now, spiritual warfare has a lot of different layers and complexities to it, a lot of which we will not get to cover in this age because of its vastness. But there's a lot of layers to it. So here are 3 main parts that you can identify in terms of spiritual warfare. 1 would be flesh versus spirit. That is spiritual warfare, basic spiritual warfare, but spiritual warfare nonetheless. A lot of people tend to write off. Number 2 would be spiritual blindness, and the 3rd one is spiritual oppression. Now, these 3 would have to be covered at another time individually, but before we can even get to that stage, we would have to even know about the realm within which these things operate, the spirit realm, and how it operates or how it applies to this physical life that we're living today. We have to understand this. Everything in this life that you see with your physical eyes, it's spiritual. There's spiritual things going on in the back end, always, with every single thing. Why? Because everything that happens in the physical realm is really just a manifestation of its equivalent in the spiritual realm. And this is possible because the spiritual realm coexists with the physical realm. To make it make sense, let's say, for example, have you ever seen in shows where in the show the person will be going from one physical realm to another quote-unquote supernatural aka spiritual realm, and when they transition into that realm, the look of it is almost identical to the physical realm. Well, that is actually accurate. That is actually how the spirit realm looks, well, at least part of it. And so, in reality, we as humans, yes, we live in this physical world, but we also at the same time live in the spiritual world as well. How is this so? Because we as humans have souls, and these souls are a part of this spiritual realm. So it's almost happening simultaneously. But the difference would be how we perceive it. In other words, we perceive this physical world with our five senses: smell, touch, sight, most important. But the spirit realm, only the soul can perceive the spirit realm. Our physical body cannot perceive naturally with our five senses. We cannot perceive the spirit realm, but we're in it by virtue of our souls being in it, if that makes sense. So let's say, for example, you're at the supermarket and you're shopping for some groceries. Now, you're in the physical, you're looking at these groceries on the shelves. You're looking at the groceries on the shelves and all of these things. You're seeing with your eyes these things that are a part of the physical. However, you also are in its spiritual equivalent in terms of the spiritual realm. You're in a supermarket, maybe not to the same goods or the same look, but you're in that same space in the spirit realm. And so while you are seeing groceries on shelves with your physical eyes, your soul is seeing what its equivalent is in the spirit realm. And that can be very scary. But if you're not in tune with your soul or with the spirit, then you will not be able to detect any differences between what you're seeing physically and what is there in the spirit realm. Hence, you see, for example, people can detect that something is off. They do not see anything or hear anything, but they just know that something is off, like almost like danger is lurking somewhere. And people normally ascribe this to having a quote-unquote gut feeling, but this is no gut feeling, as the name suggests. But what is happening is your soul is passing on information to you of what it's seeing in the spirit realm manifested. So bear that in mind the next time you have a quote-unquote gut feeling and you see it actually come to pass. So yeah, that is one way of actually interacting with the spirit realm.